Good evening and welcome to Elijah Unpacks. We've been gone for so long, but of course we're planning on how to reboot and come back looking even better, sounding even better, making more time for more issues to try unpack as much as we can of the issues that are taking place in the Department of Basic Education's area of work. We are in the area of basic education, and we have been trying to find a way to have these discussions, and we will be having more discussions with more people this time around, as opposed to the previous format in which I was talking almost on my own. So now we are going to have conversations, and we are saying we are going to have contextual conversations, because that's what is missing in most of the discourse that got to do with basic education in this country in particular, but also education in general. So we are starting tonight with a general look at the state of education in the country, and I will be focusing on the questions that the media gets to ask me, some of the conversations that we observe on social media, but conversations that also take place in the buses, in public places, in the taxis, in other places at events where we go, but also some of the issues that we also get to discuss when we're with colleagues in the corridors, during lunch, or whatever time that we get to meet and discuss the various issues that are taking place in the basic education sector. We are focusing on the basic education sector because that's all that we know. It's all that we spend our time. We spend day and night trying to figure out the best ways of delivering a quality education system for the country. We do work internally in the country, but we do visit other countries as well to learn best practices. And out of those best practices, we get to learn where we rank in terms of the comparative studies that are done when it comes to the performance of the education system, when we look at other countries who are managing similar economies like us, or other countries that are facing similar challenges as us in terms of how to navigate those. So tonight, I have with me Professor Martin Gustafsson, who is a researcher based at the Department of Basic Education, but of course, he is a Stellenbosch researcher at the Department of Socio and Economic Policy Research. And we also have Dr. Stephen Taylor, who is Director for Research Monitoring, also at the Department of Basic Education. These are academics who spend their time looking at education systems around the world, but also doing research in the country to find out what it is that we need to do. All the difficult questions that have got to do with learning outcomes, all the issues that affect the quality of learning, they get to deal with that. Martin Gustafsson focuses on the economics part. He focuses on statistics and figures and trends. He studies those in depth, but he's a teacher himself. He's been long in education. He might tell you the story. He was a teacher somewhere in Limpopo in the Vembe area many years ago, and he has experience from the classroom. So some of the things that he gets to do comes from his experience as a teacher. Let me not spend too much time. Let's get into it. Gentlemen, good evening, and thank you very much for joining me in this edition of Elijah Unpacks. So here we'll be looking at where we are as a country in terms of our own education system. Where are we? Because there's just this general accusation or general complaint from South Africans that our education system is the worst in the world. It is not preparing learners for the future world of work. The learners that are exiting the system are not equipped for life beyond basic education. There are all sorts of things that people say, and yet we see the results, the metric results, which is what the country tends to focus on, improving year on year. So we need to now go into those issues to say what is really happening in the basic education system. So I'm going to start with Professor Martin Gustafsson because I've read the stuff that you write. In fact, I use most of it. when I'm in the public discussing education, we get invited on various platforms where we're expected to talk about the state of basic education. In some instances, we're told education is in a crisis. But are we really in a crisis? That would be my first question to you, Professor Martin Gustafsson. Is the education system in South Africa in a state of crisis? And here I'm talking about basic education. Please come through.
Thank you, Elijah. Good evening. Well, I would probably give a reserved no. Our schooling system. I'm talking about the schooling system now, not the larger education system. And one easily conflates the two. But in terms of the schooling system, I would not describe it as in a state of crisis. I know that people from across the political spectrum like to use that word. I mean, I think that if you want to see crises in South Africa, look at unemployment. Look at, in particular, unemployment, the fact that we've got very weak economic growth. Those are crises. In comparison, I would say that it's difficult to conclude that our schooling system is in crisis given the evidence that we have. So let me just very briefly outline that. Firstly, when it comes to participation, we have almost everyone attends school from about age 7 to age 14, 15. And even beyond that, beyond age 15, our levels of participation are amongst the highest in the world. So we have lots of people in the schooling system compared to other countries. So there, I would say we tick the box in many ways. What about the quality of schooling? That's what people often are concerned about. But let's remember, I think it's more kind of the academics and the journalists and the politicians who are concerned about the quality of schooling. I think for ordinary South Africans, quality often means something a bit different. And it's important to keep that in mind. I think quality, for a lot of South Africans is what the school looks like. Is there discipline in the school? Are people nice to each other? Those are incredibly important things. But it's not the totality of quality. So the bigger quality question, which a lot of ordinary South Africans, I think, often miss out on, is about learning. All right. So you want a nice school environment, but you also want to make sure that children can read by age 10, which is something that gets repeated in the political discourse. We must make sure children can read properly by age 10. Those are things where we are falling short, and we are, in fact, still worse than other middle-income countries at the primary level. At the secondary level, I think we've actually caught up to other developing countries. But at the primary level, we are behind. But why do I say that that's not necessarily a crisis? Because we're getting better. There's a lot of evidence which shows that over the years, we've been a fairly resilient system. The things that we have done may not have been perfect, but learning levels are going up, and these things never change overnight. Never. So the fact that kind of the patient is improving means a lot. So that's why I'd say that there's quite a bit of hope. I think that we should allow ourselves, and I'm not too convinced that it's in a state of absolute crisis.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Now, Dr. Taylor, let me come to you. But what is the context of South Africa's education system? And I'm asking this question on the basis of us coming from a history where there were 19 education administrations, each area of the country, depending on where you were, running its own system. And come 1994, democracy comes, we go to the polls, we vote. 95, 96, we are working on transforming the system. The South African Schools Act come into application by 96. From 97, we grapple with other issues. So really, we've been a system that has been work in progress since then. But where are we? I mean, after merging all those education systems from the past, where are we? Are we in the bottom? Are we at the top? Are we in the middle? Or are we fluctuating between the worst and the best?
Right. And when you say where are we, I guess you're speaking about in international context and compared to other countries around the world, and in particular in the region, perhaps. So I think let me start with the context. Like you say, we can't forget the historical context that we're coming from. And unfortunately, the crisis discourse, which you've just been talking about, has the sense that maybe things have suddenly gotten worse and that perhaps in the past things were better. Maybe the pass marks were higher, or we had more people taking maths. And these kinds of narratives, I think, are unhelpful because the historical context was much worse than where we are today. For example, and obviously there's a racial dimension to this because historically, the education system, as with much of South African society, was unequal deliberately on the basis of race. And so we come from a situation historically where if you look at Black South Africans born in the 1950s and 1960s, roughly 1 in 10 of them went on to complete matric, or grade 12 or equivalent. Whereas today's generation of Black South Africans, you see over 60% of them successfully completing matric or equivalent qualification. So things are sort of unequivocally better than what they were back then. And I think that is important. Martin also spoke about the improvements, even that we've continued to see since 1994. And even obviously, when it comes to access, there's been tremendous improvement. The numbers of children who reach matric every year, who complete matric, the numbers who get a bachelor level pass, and the numbers who enter university, these numbers are all improving over time and in ways that are pro-equity. But the concerns are around quality, and even there have been some improvement in the international assessment. The international assessments, often people look at it as a kind of a league table and they say, where are we in the world? Now, unfortunately, we are very ambitious and we participate in 2 assessments, one called TIMS, which stands for Trends in International Maths and Science Study, and one called PIRLS, which stands for Progress in International Reading Literacy Study. And we are one of only a few African countries that participate. So we're comparing ourselves there to mostly European, East Asian, North American countries, and we do pretty poorly. We are generally roughly at the bottom, not every time right at the bottom, but roughly at the bottom of that list. But when we look at regional assessments, there's one called SACMEC, you see that we are actually slightly above average for the region. And there also we've been improving. So the idea that we're worst in the world is unfortunately, I mean, there's a whole story back around how that narrative developed, and it was based on a very flawed methodology that one used. But we're improving. We still have a long way to go. We definitely do have a quality challenge. But as Martin said, it's not a new crisis. It's not as if things were actually better at some time in the past. The pandemic hurt us a little bit just in the last few years. So there was sort of a brief dip, but the general long-term trend is definitely one of improvement that we see in the system. So historically, things were not better in the past, and we shouldn't sort of forget that. But change does take a long time, as Martin said. There's still a long way to go. We still have massive inequalities, even though we've had a lot of pro-poor schooling policies ever since the late 90s, and even increasing since then. So you mentioned the unification of the system from all the different racially separate education departments into one unified department. That was a really important administrative development. But there have been a range of pro-poor policies that the government has rolled out. The school nutrition program, where these days we feed about 10 million children every day a nutritious meal. The no-fee policy, so that many children benefit, about 70% or more of our children benefit from not having to pay school fees. Those are just a few of the kind of policies that have helped drive improvements, especially in the more historically disadvantaged parts of the country.
Yeah, just still on that, you're talking about the history and the context. One of the issues that has been very difficult to explain away for South Africans, in fact, it's probably the single biggest issue that you will ever try to explain to South Africans, but they don't want to hear it, they don't want to understand, is the issue of the pass mark. Maybe just talk to us through it, because I know you've written several pieces over the years, just trying to unpack that, to say that things were not better in the past. Actually, things are better now. Can you just maybe use that as an example of one of the things that you would like to maybe zoom into when you want to explain some of the differences of the systems from the past and where we are now?
Absolutely, yeah, that is a vexing issue that keeps coming up every year when the matric results come out. There's this narrative, pass mark, and that's far too low a bar. But I think what is often implied in that narrative is that maybe the pass mark or the pass criteria have been lowered or made easier over time, and that's not true at all. In fact, there was never a time historically where the pass mark was 50% for subjects. In fact, historically, there was even a standard grade, a lower grade pass that was 25% that existed in the past. So that's the first myth, is that maybe in the past the standards were higher. That's not true at all. The second problem with that is that you can't get 30% for all your subjects in pass matric. The pass criteria is a little bit more complex than that. You need to pass a home language. Then you need to get at least 3 subjects where you pass the 40% level, and then another 3 subjects that you pass at the 30% level. So it is a bit more complicated than that. It's also not what's necessary for university acceptance. There's high pass criteria for a diploma pass or a bachelor level pass. So yeah, I think that critique is sort of missing the mark, and I don't think that we can somehow improve the fundamental quality of education by changing the pass criteria. What we actually need to do is keep improving the quality of teaching and learning, so that more children get over the pass criteria, whatever that pass criteria are. So I hope that helps with that debate.
Yeah. For now, I know it's something that we'll have to come back to at some other point, because this one is a very difficult one. We might need other people maybe to ask questions so that you give that clarification that is much needed, because every time you explain it to some people, they say they understand when you are talking to them about it, but later on they go back and repeat exactly what they came with even before they asked you the question. Now, Martin, the world, how do they view us? How do they view a learner who who's in the schooling system in South Africa, gets their matric, and they want to go overseas? Does the world look at that in doubt, as we often do as South Africans, or they look at a South African NSC certificate qualification as any other qualification that can enable a young person from South Africa to study at any university anywhere in the world?
Before I can get to that, if I can just follow up on some of the points Stephen was making. The people may often think the pass mark is 50, but that's within the term examinations. It's not in the final examinations. I think that's where a lot of the confusion lies. So we're well aware that the pass mark has been 50 in the within year school-based assessment. That's what the curriculum says. But the pass marks in the grade 12 national examinations, Stephen is absolutely correct. They have always been quite low. And I mean, I don't think that we must be, fanatical about saying that nothing should change. There is a reasonable kind of scope for debate when it comes to the pass mark, but what I don't think should happen is some kind of knee-jerk reaction where people think that changing from 30 to 50 in matric is suddenly going to make people learn differently in schools. The evidence does not support that schooling systems work that way. Quality gets better because teachers teach better. There's accountability for learning. There's no country in the world that I'm aware of that has boosted quality by changing the pass mark. And let's remember that if we change the system, if we change those pass marks, we are automatically going to get maybe 100,000, 200,000 fewer matriculants immediately. Can you imagine the political repercussions of that? Can you imagine what it means for youth suicides? Can you imagine what it means for the comparability of the matric in the labor market? You go to all of a sudden the matric means something different. You're going to confuse employers. There's a lot of value in having stability in something like the national senior certificate. And if you change things, you need to look very, very carefully. I don't think any of us, Stephen and myself, are not saying that nothing should change, but we need to have a very informed debate. And there's no magic bullet here. Okay, to your question, Elijah, what does the world think of us? I mean, I haven't looked at this in depth, but what is interesting is that important institutions, World Bank, UNESCO, the McKinsey people who do this periodic report on the state of education in the world, these organizations are actually looking quite positively at South Africa. I mean, McKinsey last year came out with this finding that we're among the 7 fastest improvers in the world, and of those 3 are developing countries. 4 are rich countries. The other 2 are Morocco and Peru. So Morocco, Peru, South Africa, we're the fast runners in the sprint to try and improve results. And I don't think they've misinterpreted the data. I've been saying this, many in South Africa have been saying this, that there are some very important positive trends, and they're now being picked up by global organizations, and that would have some influence on how people think about our schooling system. And the fact that we participate in these international tests, the fact that we kind of put our necks out there. I mean, Stephen was saying that there are very few developing countries that get into TIMS and Pearls. We've done it, and sure, we may be near the bottom of the list of those mainly rich countries, but it also, I think, earns us respect that we are participating in these kinds of evaluations. We're being very honest about our quality problem. We've acknowledged it, and I think partly because we've acknowledged it, we have been able to improve because we know that we need to do something. And moving forward, sure, Stephen and I have said that there are a lot of good things that have been happening. Does that mean that those good things are going to continue to happen automatically? No. There are all sorts of political implementation factors that could get in the way and stop us from improving further. So we have to work very hard at making sure that we do new things that make sense, that have been tested, that are cost effective. For example, interventions to improve reading. And there, I think we have, in the world, we are considered as pretty good in terms of the research, knowledge that we have, the development we've been doing with respect to our 11 official languages, materials in all of those languages. We are looked upon as, in a way, a model country for understanding the reading and learning problem in the initial grades. What I think we need to do more of is just to take action based on the evidence that we have.
Yeah. So with that said, you mentioned reading. One of the things that Stephen does, Dr. Taylor there, is to manage the early grade reading study. From that exercise that you do, I think you do it in the Northwest and Mpumalanga, I don't know where else you do this, but what are you learning there in terms of the change that Martin's talking about, saying that we agree that something must change? From the reading point of view, what must change, particularly the early grade reading? Stephen?
Yes, I think we've focused quite a lot on early grade reading and home language literacy in particular, because it's a really important strategic area of learning that affects a lot of later learning. And so we've been evaluating different ways to support schools and teachers and children, and to understand which of these ways have the biggest impact on. And so we've learned quite a lot about what works and what doesn't work so well. One important lesson is that not everything actually has an impact on learning. But what we have found is that a particular combination of support, if we give teachers lesson plans which are aligned to the curriculum, we give them additional reading materials in the language that they need to be teaching in. And in some of our languages, there's been development work that was necessary to provide enough storybooks and materials that are appropriate for learning to read in those languages. And then if we also provide effective forms of support to teachers, like meaningful training, on-site coaching has been particularly effective. And so we've developed quite a lot of evidence around what works. And we've done some of this in the Northwest, some of it in Mpumalanga. More recently, we've shifted the program to the Northern Cape as well. So there's been quite increasing take-up of this combination of support. And so hopefully this is something that we can build on as we develop and roll out our national literacy plans as the department, as other provinces develop their own plans, as we raise more funds for early foundational literacy work. I think we do have some evidence around what can improve things in the early grades. And in that way address one key part of the quality challenge, which is learning to read with adequate comprehension, particularly in home language. I think that's the other really important learning that we have here, is that what we found is that when we intervene to support home language literacy in early grades, we actually found long-term benefits for English also. There was like a spillover onto learning to read in English better. But when we intervene to support English as an additional language in the foundation phase, that helped for English, but it didn't actually have a positive spillover back to home language. So what we've learned is it's really strategic to support home language learning to read in early grades. And so that was something that I think the sector is generally really increasingly understanding the need to support our home language learning. And building on that, as we get to grade 4, 5, and 6, and even beyond, you'll know of the department's mother tongue-based bilingual education efforts now, which aim to make more use of mother tongue and home language even beyond the foundation phase, because the current situation has been that for most South African children, they learn through their home language in grades 1 to 3, but then experience a difficult transition to English as a language of instruction in grade 4 and beyond. And so what I'm saying is, let's make more use of mother tongue, more use of home language for longer, to give children the best chance of learning as much as possible through the languages that are their own and that they best understand. So those are some of the learnings and lessons that are now being applied by the department.
But in all the years of doing this particular study, for as long as I've known you, you've been issuing report after report. Are you seeing any change? Are you seeing any improvement at all in terms of the performance of the learners, even the teachers that you're interacting with on this one?
Well, we do, remember, we're doing research, so we're doing kind of experiments in 50 or 100 schools at a time. And so in some of these cases, we've seen improvements in where we've provided these forms of support. Those improvements have even lasted quite a few years, and we're tracking those children to understand the long-term benefits of receiving a more impactful home language literacy experience in the foundation phase. But what we still need to do in the sector is scale that up to a larger scale. So I don't think we've yet been able to roll out those forms of support on a large enough scale that we are seeing it influence our country scores in things like PEARLs or these international assessments. So I think before we see further impacts at a national scale, we need to scale up some of those forms of support, which currently we haven't been able to do. And the reality is that I think the current situation is one of financial constraints for the education system, especially in the provinces. And so there hasn't been a lot of new government money to provide new forms of programs at scale yet, but hopefully that will come with time.
Yeah, so does that mean that the sector is not embracing the learnings from the early grade reading study as you present these across the sector for provinces to take some of the best practices from the findings in the report?
I would say that the sector is embracing it in parts, in places. Some provinces, maybe more than others, are embracing it. Other parts of the DBE are embracing aspects of the program. Like the curriculum branch is including aspects of the work in some of the revisions to the curriculum and guidelines that are being shared with schools. Even other organizations out there, NGOs, literacy organizations, are adopting some of the best practices. So I'd say the influence is there, but it's maybe not yet a kind of a coordinated, centralized, full-scale program of support that has been able to be implemented. And I think it's various reasons. As I mentioned, finances is one reason why it's maybe been difficult to scale this up even more than we have. Coordination is a challenge in the sector. We have 9 provincial departments. Even within the national department, we have different branches responsible for different aspects of programming. So there's a lot of different things going on in the sector, and I think maybe we need to do more of just coordination within the sector to make sure we align all these initiatives. There's a lot going on, not just in early grade reading. ECD is a massive area of priority for the department at the moment. There's a lot of work going on there. I mentioned the extension of mother tongue based bilingual education as well. So I think there's just a lot going on, and this aspect of support to reading in home languages needs to find its place relative to all the different things that are going on in the sector at the moment.
Yeah. Martin, on your side, what do you think needs to change? What is holding us, yes, as a country back from achieving at the level that other countries are performing?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, I don't think that we have been held back that badly because we've been on this improvement trajectory. So the challenge is, can we sustain this? Can we continue to improve? Because if we go flat from here, then that is, I would say that's a crisis. We need to see a continuation of the improvements we've seen over the last 20 years. What we've seen over the last 20 years has been great, but it's not enough. So where do we need to improve? I think there's something that's incredibly important and interesting if you compare our primary and secondary schools. So at the secondary level, what is really significant is that the 2023 TIMSS results that were released last year show that after continuous improvements, we are now at a level of other similar developing countries. We're roughly on the same level as Brazil. All right. That doesn't mean that we need to stop there, but we're not a laggard. We're not the kid running, way behind everyone else. That's at the secondary level. At the primary level, the TIMSS data, also the PIRLS data and other data indicate that we are still quite behind. But if everything in the secondary level depends on what happens in the primary level, how can we kind of be doing better at the secondary than at the primary? I mean, this is a fascinating question. And I think that a lot has to do with the language transition that Stephen was referring to. This slows down learning in significant ways in the primary level, and we have to try and make this work better. But there's another factor, and that is that the secondary level has incredibly high levels of school accountability for learning. School principals, talk to any school principal, they sweat over the NSC results. If they're school performs poorly in those exams year after year, there are consequences personally for the school principal and for the school as a whole. At the primary level, you wouldn't expect that kind of accountability. And I think in some ways, we tried to bring about that kind of accountability with the annual national assessments, which were dropped because the unions didn't like them. But even a lot of education academics didn't like it for various reasons. And I think some of those reasons are good. I think there were problems with ANA, but I think it's just unavoidable that you need to have some kind of school accountability at the primary level. Stephen was talking about support. Yes, you need support, but support on its own doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to take, say, reading seriously. And I think we need to learn from what's currently being done in the country. I would say that in about a third of the country, there is school accountability at the primary level. It's there in Gauteng, it's there in Western Cape, and it's emerging in Free State. Western Cape and Gauteng have very different approaches to it, but I think both are interesting, and I think the country as a whole needs to learn from this. So Western Cape has its systemic tests, which cost quite a bit of money, and they may not be easy or cost effective to roll out across the country, but it does give the Western Cape Department of Education some sense of what's happening in grade 3 and grade 6. They test every learner using exactly the same test. The tests are marked outside the school. It's essential, obviously, that you need that kind of standardization. Gauteng has a very different approach. They, through this oral reading fluency program that they've introduced, which is linked to a lot of the support that Stephen was describing. This program in Gauteng doesn't test every child. It involves district officials going into schools. They have a list, they have a method. They need to randomly select about 10 learners, get them into a room, make them feel comfortable, say, look, here's a reading passage. Can you read? They have a particular way of assessing this. They put this into a database, and then the provincial department has this data. That means that the Gauteng Education Department has some sense of which primary schools are doing better than others relative to their environment. And obviously, you have to look at everything in terms of you can't evaluate a school in Sandton in the same way that you would evaluate a school in Alex because of factors of poverty and so on. But you can certainly analyze schools with similar socioeconomic circumstances to each other and start saying, okay, in this school, there's something going on. Either we need more support or some other intervention, or the school principal needs to be changed. We need to look at what is going wrong in this school. That is what accountability, school accountability is. One has to do it very carefully because teacher unions, I think, are justifiably concerned about accountability that's unfair or perverse in some way. You have to avoid that. We can't have another ANA, but I think we can learn from, in particular, what Gauteng has done, and to some extent, Free State is introducing this as well. I think that is where we kind of have, a window of opportunity, and the costs are very high.
Now, let's talk about something that I found you two discussing and debating yesterday afternoon towards lunch. And it's something that, as the debate was going, that we need to continue to grapple with as a country. Mathematics. What is the state of mathematics in the country? In context, where were we before 2008, Stephen, regarding mathematics? I know in the recent weeks and months, there's been a huge debate around schools that are not offering mathematics. There was that number of 464 schools that were not offering mathematics. There was a parliament question. The responses there sparked a lot of debate about whether there's a crisis around mathematics education in the country or not. I know that there is a context to it, and Stephen, yesterday you touched on that. I would like you to just share with us tonight in terms of that context, because you said to me, not in the past it was not compulsory for every child to do mathematics. There was a time when you could just go through the schooling system without having to choose maths as a subject. But things have changed now, and that we need to look at this debate. We need to look at the numbers in context. Can you just go to that and talk to us about the history of mathematics education in the country? And Martin, I know you've written papers before around the performance, the uptake of math as a subject versus maths literacy, that whole debate. I'll come to you after Stephen has given us the historical context and where we are as a country and what it is that we need to do. Stephen?
Yes, right now the debate is once again going on about mathematics as opposed to maths literacy. So the current situation is that children in matric generally either take mathematics or math literacy. There's also technical mathematics, which has recently been introduced, but smaller percentages of children take that. And so the concern is that a lot of children are taking maths literacy, and people obviously feel like that's not as important as maths, and people want to see higher maths participation. What I think people often forget is that in the past, as you say, it wasn't compulsory to take maths of any sort. So I actually recently saw an article in the media which said perhaps it's time to make maths compulsory again. And it assumed that it had been compulsory in the past, but what people forget is that before 2008, when the National Senior Certificate was introduced, you had some children in the grade 10 to 12 phase taking mathematics higher grade. Some children took maths standard grade, but about half of all matriculants did not take maths of any kind. And that's what gets forgotten. Since 2008, with the introduction of maths and maths literacy, now everyone takes some form of maths, even if about half of the children take maths literacy. And as a result, if we look at the number of children every year who have passed some kind of mathematics, that number has increased massively over the years. Before 2008, it was under 200,000 children every year would pass some kind of mathematics in matric. But since 2008, the number then jumped to almost 400,000, and now it's over 500,000. So we have a lot more children these days coming out of the school system with some sort of a mathematics pass, even if for some of them it's maths literacy. So again, it's an example of the historical context didn't offer better access to mathematics by any means. We would like to see more maths, more people taking and passing mathematics itself. But the problem currently is that a lot of children who take maths actually fail maths. So it's not going to be very strategic to just make more children take maths in matric. The way we want to improve the system is through better teaching and learning of maths earlier on, so that more children are equipped to take mathematics and pass mathematics. So it is a very important outcome to see that we get more mathematics passes, but maths participation in itself is not an outcome that we should be chasing. Maths participation is only valuable to the extent that it helps more children pass maths. That's the key outcome, is passing maths. And I mean, going even further back historically, I think we do have to acknowledge that this is a sense of quite an emotive topic, because under apartheid, I mean, there were famous quotes. There's one famous quote by Verwoerd in those days who said something like, "What's the point of teaching an African child mathematics if there's no place he can use it in later life?" You know, that's the background we come from. So it's a super emotive, historically loaded topic. We definitely understand that, and we definitely want better access to maths and better outcomes in maths. But again, we shouldn't fall into the trap then of thinking that sometime in the past we actually had better maths access. It's actually better than it's ever been. We still need to improve it by a lot. We need to improve not only mathematics passes, but higher level passes. We need to improve the numbers of children getting 50% and 60% for mathematics, which gets them access into key courses at university as well. So a lot to be done in maths, but I would say where the solutions lie is again early grades in rolling out effective forms of learner and teacher support, so that we do a better job of teaching the fundamentals of mathematics, so that more children can successfully take mathematics in matric.
Martin, what are you finding in the research work that you do, the uptake in terms of maths as a subject and the performance thereof? I know you've previously done some analysis in terms of um, boys and girls and urban, rural, and all those types of things. What insights can you share with us regarding some of the key findings that you are getting from the work that you do?
Okay, so I mean, we have a lot of data in the department, not just the examination results, but who is moving through the system and who is leaving the system. So we are now in a good position when it comes to understanding what some would call the true throughput rate, because the NSC results on their own are very difficult to interpret because, as people rightly point out, what happens before grade 12, before those exams? How many people are falling out of the system before that? I know Free State is very high in the pass rate rankings, and sometimes I get into trouble pointing out that, well, this is in part because Free State gets rid of a lot of weaker learners before grade 12. So what one needs to look at is the entire system, and I've spent quite a lot of time on this, and there are some surprising results that we need to learn from. So what is quite clear is that this kind of anecdotal evidence that Limpopo kids do well in maths is actually true. The data do support that. If you're black or colored in South Africa, and you're going through the schooling system, your chances of getting 60% in maths, and 60% is a very important threshold because a lot of university programs require this if they have some kind of mathematical orientation. The percentage of young black people in South Africa who are getting 60% is highest in Limpopo. Now that's a surprise because you wouldn't expect that. At the primary level, Limpopo's results are not good. And it's a relatively poor province. Poorer areas of the country have difficulty attracting good teachers. So what is really going on there? I think there's a lot more research we need to do, but people are not altogether surprised. There's certain things that Limpopo does when it comes to subject advisor practices at schools that are a little different from what is done in other provinces. So there's a strong mathematics tradition in that province, and to some extent in Mpumalanga as well. So the question is, we need to look more closely at that. And the flip side of that argument is that urban areas are not doing well. Because the interesting thing is that whether you look at Eastern Cape or Free State, even KwaZulu-Natal, urban areas are either doing the same as rural areas when it comes to black youths or worse. So the flip side of this rural kind of achievement story is what on earth is happening to black youth in urban areas. So we're very used to saying that we have a big rural problem and rural disadvantage. And yes, of course, there are rural factors that make education very difficult. But let's not forget that there are urban problems as well. And I think a lot of those are probably socio-cultural problems. What are youths doing? What are youths thinking? What are they doing in their weekends? And so on. And those are things I think we need to look more closely at, our urban youth.
Yeah, Martin, you said something that led us nicely to the last segment of this discussion. So I'd like us to use the last 8 minutes discussing this one. And it's a topic that usually makes me run straight to you and Stephen. The one around the throughput rate that you mentioned, and commonly referred to as the dropout rate. What are the issues there? Because, we often debate with the people who say half the children are not reaching matric, and then they say they've dropped out, and then we come back and say they didn't drop out, they're still in the system. The real problem is the failure rate. And then we say, what is the true dropout rate? So there are many facets to this debate. Stephen, would you like to have a first bite on this one?
Sure. I think there are various ways of defining dropout rate. So some people use the word throughput rate and they use the word dropout rate, and they're often not very precise about what they mean. What is the definition of this rate? I think what really matters is, and I think what most people are intuitively trying to get at, is what percentage of all children successfully go on to complete the National Senior Certificate or an equivalent qualification at college or somewhere like that. So that's intuitively what people mean. But sometimes they use wrong methods to get at that. So sometimes what people do is they look at the number of grade 1 enrollments, sometimes 12 years earlier, and they compare that to the number of NSE passes in the November exams. And that leads to quite a substantial underestimate of how many people actually go on to pass an NSE or an equivalent qualification for various reasons. One is because you're only counting November NSE passes, and there's actually the June exams as well. There's also those who get an equivalent qualification outside of the schooling system. But also, perhaps more importantly, actually, the numbers of children enrolled in earlier grades, especially in grade 1, is artificially high because of grade repetition. So the fact that maybe 15% roughly of children repeat grade 1 means that you're essentially overcounting grade 1s by about 50%. To give an extreme example to explain the logic of that, if the repetition rate in grade 1 was 100, that would mean that everybody spends 2 years in grade 1, which would mean that essentially you have all the 7-year-olds and all the 8-year-olds in the country sitting in grade 1. So you would be double counting the number of people, but only once counting matric passes. So there's wrong ways of getting at it. What are the correct statistics? We often measure this using household survey data, where we look at an age range like 22 to 25-year-olds. So an age group who are old enough that they're no longer, many of them still likely to still complete matric, but young enough that they're representative of a relatively recent cohort of people. So we're not comparing people who were in the school system historically. And there we see that in the most recent years, a little bit over 60% of all youths successfully complete NSE or an equivalent qualification. And there are a few other ways of measuring it, but that's kind of the number that the base methods are getting us to these days, is a little bit over 60% who successfully complete that. That has been improving over time. We still want to improve that further, sure. We still want to reduce inequalities across socioeconomic status, across race group, across gender, by the way. Females are much more likely to successfully complete matric than males. There's a whole discussion, a whole podcast I think you need to have on the gender issues in the education system at the moment. But the important thing is that this, whether you call it the dropout rate or whether you call it the grade 12 completion rate, which is like the positive way of finding the same issue, things have been improving over time. It's again one of those things where we want things to improve more, but the trend is positive. It's not a new crisis. The dropout crisis is not a new thing. It's never been better in the past. I mentioned to you how people born in the 50s and 60s were much less likely to successfully complete a grade 12 level qualification than today. So things are improving. We still want to get things better. And again, I keep coming back to the way to do that is not by tinkering with the pass criteria or things like that. It's about fundamentally improving the quality of learning and teaching, especially primary. So yeah, I think that covers some of the dropout discussions. There's more that can be said about, what is the department doing to address dropout. We have a lot of programs that are trying to mitigate against dropout. Things like the policy to manage learner pregnancies. We want to make sure that if girl learners get pregnant, that they don't leave the system, they stay in the school system and complete the system. But what is interesting is that despite some factors like pregnancy and family responsibilities, which tend to only affect girl learners are still more likely to stay in school and complete school compared to boy learners, which is is an increasing puzzle and issue that needs attention. So yeah, lots more that could be said, but those are definitely some of the issues that before when we talk about drop.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Stephen. Thanks very much indeed. Martin, in 2 minutes, what would be your take on the issue of the dropout rate or the throughput rate debate?
Well, I mean, Stephen has covered the key issues. I mean, I'd probably add just two things. The one is that for any developing country to get everyone to complete 12 years of education successfully, because that's what matric is, it's a long journey. And the question is, where are we relative to other countries? Well, we're about on the line of a typical middle income country. So this is not an indicator where we do particularly badly at. It's improving. So I would say that this is one of the least things that we should worry about. We should turn that concern kind of around a bit so that we get more parliamentarians, people, journalists, etc., to worry about the quality of schooling. I think we also need to look at the grade 9 certificate, which is emerging. It's being piloted currently. How will that change things? How will that change the debates?
Yeah. All right. Thanks very much. I think from both of you, the things that you've said are leading us in different directions in terms of the discussions that we need to have. I know that you've done in-depth research on a variety of topics. Some of them you just touched on them briefly tonight, and we may have to revisit some of those topics and in the future. But for tonight, thanks very much. I know it was more of a general introductory discussion on a variety of issues that South Africans are worried about in terms of the quality of the education system and the learners that are coming out of the system and some of the factors around the dropout rate as well as mathematics education in the country. So we've done as much as we could in an hour. I know we need more time for other topics. We'll arrange those and bring other people who see things differently. This is just a start, but we'll bring other role players, those that are in the sector, so that they also give us a different perspective. So in the future, it will be one of you, or we'll bring other people as well that will give us a perspective on some of the things that you've spoken about. But for tonight, let me thank you very much for your time and for sharing your insights in terms of the work that you do. And from me, Elijah Mklanga, thanks very much. This was the first episode of Elijah Unpacks Reloaded. This one is live. Join us next time. Also, please suggest topics that we can talk about. And perhaps if you can, also give us names and contact information of guests that we can also invite into this discussion. Thank you very much and take care until next time.